Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're breaking down some truly fascinating source material to see exactly how the Mexica transformed from late-arriving underdogs into the architects of the mighty Aztec Empire. Let me tell you, it's a wild story of survival, sharp strategy, and just spectacular growth. So, how did a minor city-state stuck in a literal swamp become the dominant power in the basin of Mexico? That's the main question we're answering today. Just think about this dramatic contrast for a second. We're looking at a marginalized group of people, forced to settle on the absolute worst, swampiest real estate available, who somehow engineered a rise to unprecedented imperial dominance. I mean, how exactly do they pull that off? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the origins of the Mexica. Then, the turning point. Third, the engine of empire. Fourth, ruling an informal empire. And finally, the Aztec formula for power. Starting with Part 1, Origins of the Mexica, from Aztlan to the Marshes. Okay, so picture this. When the Mexica arrived in the basin of Mexico around 1250, the place was already packed. It was completely dominated by established, powerful civilizations like the Toltecs. The Mexica themselves had migrated from a mythical homeland called Aztlan, and when they got to this highly competitive basin, all the prime agricultural land was already taken. Naturally, right? But according to their traditions, their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, guided them to settle exactly where they saw an eagle eating a snake on a cactus. So, in 1325, they founded Tenochtitlan. The catch? It was in the marshy, highly undesirable middle of Lake Texcoco. At the time, this looked like a massive geographic disadvantage, but as you'll see, it actually became the bedrock of their entire success. Now, to really grasp how this world functioned, we have to talk about the Altepetl. The basin of Mexico wasn't just wide open land. It was absolutely filled with these independent city-states, each known as an Altepetl. Every single one had an urban administrative center, surrounding villages, and its own ruler, called a Tlatoani. And let me tell you, these city-states were fiercely competitive. They were constantly fighting each other for influence and resources. But it wasn't all just warfare. They also formed these incredibly complex alliances to facilitate trade. It was a very dynamic, constantly shifting geopolitical landscape. Moving on to Part 2, the turning point, the 1428 rebellion. You know, early on, Tenochtitlan was actually completely subjugated by a powerful alliance called the Teponica, who were based over in Azcapotzalco. And this relationship was brutally oppressive. The Teponica kept demanding heavier and heavier tribute. Eventually, they just pushed too far. So in 1428, led by a ruler named Itzcoatl, the Mexica revolted. But here's the crucial part. They didn't do it alone. They joined forces with two other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan, to form the legendary Triple Alliance. Together, they absolutely crushed their Teponica overlords. And this didn't just remove a local rival, oh no. It created an unstoppable new military force. Now, what's really interesting here is how they divided the spoils of war. Even though they collaborated militarily, they weren't exactly equal partners. Tenochtitlan and Texcoco took the lion's share, roughly 2/5 or 40% each. The weaker partner, Tlacopan, took the remaining 1/5 or 20%. It was a highly pragmatic division of wealth, but it worked. It kept the alliance unified and extremely potent. Which brings us to Part 3, the engine of empire, economics, and tribute. We almost always think of empire strictly in terms of military victories, right? But the true powerhouse that built the Aztec Empire was purely economic. Once a city-state was conquered by the alliance, they were forced to provide regular, highly valuable tribute. And we're not just talking about a few baskets of corn here. Conquered areas had to hand over intricate textiles, elaborate warrior costumes, cacao beans, precious metals, and jewelry. This proves that Aztec conquest was fundamentally about fueling a massive continuous economic engine. So to manage this staggering influx of wealth, the empire had to develop highly organized logistics. They used specialized Aztec tribute collectors, known as calpishke, to ensure the goods kept flowing smoothly. Working right alongside them were the tameme, or porters. These guys physically transported all these incredible resources along dedicated roads straight into the major warehouses of the Triple Alliance cities. The logistical network they built to pull this off was just monumental. And the sheer scale of this system, it's breathtaking. At its absolute height, a staggering 38 provinces were regularly sending tribute right into the capital. Think about that for a second. 38 provinces. It created this massive, self-sustaining loop where military conquest generated vast economic resources, which then directly funded even more military expansion. It completely reshaped their entire style of governance. Next up, Part 4. Ruling an Informal Empire. The Triple Alliance actually challenges our modern idea of what an empire is, mostly because they didn't really micromanage their territories. Historians like Camilla Townsend describe this model as an informal empire. Check out the balance here. When a city-state was conquered, its internal political structure often stayed exactly the same. They kept their own rulers, their own governments, and their own cultures. But economically, they were utterly transformed by the crushing requirement to pay that tribute we just talked about. The Aztecs projected power and extracted wealth without taking on the headache of administering local governments. Pretty smart, right? Internally, within the Triple Alliance itself, collaboration was absolutely key. They didn't just share the spoils of war, they actually shared expertise. For instance, Texcoco was famous for its engineering and its legal system. So in 1449, the ruler of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma I, utilized the brilliant Texcocan ruler Nezahualcóyotl to design a massive 16-kilometer dike right across Lake Texcoco. This perfectly demonstrates how the alliance allowed them to achieve these massive collective projects that no single city-state could have ever accomplished on its own. But despite all this cooperation, Tenochtitlan grew increasingly dominant over its partners. Remember that initially terrible, marshy island location? Well, it turned out to be incredibly strategic for controlling trade routes and launching military campaigns. Because of this, by the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan had absolutely exploded in size, boasting up to 300,000 inhabitants. Just to put that into perspective based on our sources, that made it larger than literally any city in Europe at the time. Incredible. Finally, we arrive at Part 5, the Aztec formula for power. Let's bring all this source material together and synthesize exactly how they achieved this rapid, massive expansion. And this brilliantly illustrates that it wasn't just one single event. It was a masterfully interconnected six-step loop. First, it started with their unique geography on Lake Texcoco, which they cleverly leveraged into military power. That power enabled the conquest of neighboring Altepetli, which instantly resulted in forced tribute. That tribute brought massive economic resources flowing right back into the capital, which, you guessed it, funded further expansion. It was a perpetual, self-sustaining engine of power. So I want to leave you with a provocative question to chew on today. Looking at the awe-inspiring rise of the Aztec Empire, is an informal empire, one held together not by strict local political control, but by the relentless extraction of wealth and tribute, ultimately stronger or weaker than a strictly centralized state? It's a fascinating way to look at the nature of power, cooperation, and economics in the ancient world. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring these incredible histories.